guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with my booktube and reading goals for 2020. I'm filming this video a little bit early, posting it a little bit early as well. It's going out in December instead of January, so obviously haven't done my goals reflections for 2019 yet and haven't even finished all of those goals. I'm still working on them, but I do have just kind of a general idea of what they're going to be like, and I wanted to get this video out since I had been thinking about goals for next year for a while. Kind of had an idea of what worked, what didn't, what I needed to change, and what I wanted to focus on. So if I reference things from my goals of last year, I'm like, maybe I read this many books. That's why, because I'm still kind of working on all of them, but I did have the gist down of what I wanted for next year. Like last year, this is going to be split into two sections. There's going to be the actual numbers of genres and types of books and stuff like that, and then there's going to be the more booktube community focused section. So the first section is all the fun numbers. I want to read X number of these books and all of that. So the first goal is obviously the most basic goal. It's the Goodreads challenge, how many books you want to read in a year. Mine is 100. It was 100 last year. It was 100 the year before that. It's always 100. Even before I set goals, my goal for reading for the year was always 100. It just sounds nice to me, and it puts my pace at 2 books per week with 2 weeks to screw up and not read anything, which I feel like is a good pace for me. That's just a concept of reading that I am comfortable with. In 2019, I read way more than that. In 2018, I read 99 books, but just in general, 100 books a year is a good goal for me, regardless of what I actually hit. My second goal is 15 translated books. I do read a few translated books every year. That's something that always just naturally makes its way into my reading. Sometimes my favorite books are translated, but I don't read very many of them. And I think that's something I noticed as I was keeping track of stats this year, how few were translated, and I always kind of thought I read more, which maybe I have in the past, and this year was just a slow year for that. But I do want to make kind of an effort to read more. And reading 15 allows for a few to come up naturally, but also forces me to seek out some translated books. And I think that's a good goal for me. So 15 translated books. It doesn't really matter from where. I would like to have, varied translations, so it's not all just Japanese translations. But that's not a specific part of the goal. The goal is just 15, and the implication is that I will probably read a couple of different languages just naturally. I would like to do 3 poetry discussions this year, which kind of suggests that I would have to read 3 works of poetry and understand them enough to discuss them. In 2019, I had 1 poetry discussion, which was on Aniara, which I am very glad I read. But I would like to branch out and continue reading more poetry. And I don't think 3 is a huge goal. I think that's something that I should be able to hit as long as I just make an effort in that regard to hit it. So 3 poetry discussions, which means 3 works of poetry. In 2019, I had a really bad nonfiction goal. It was just to read 5 nonfiction books that were hard or outside my comfort zone. And that wound up being way too vague to be of any use to me, so I didn't really hit it, but I also didn't not hit it. It was a bad goal. So I have more specific goals this year for nonfiction. The first is to read 5 nonfiction books about or set in countries that I'm unfamiliar with. And that is vague. That's a little bit vague. But I do have some countries that I kind of gravitate towards when I'm reading, especially nonfiction. I read a lot that's set in America. Obviously, I am American, so that makes sense. I read a fair amount that's set in the UK. I read some that's set in Germany, some in North Korea. There are just a couple of go-to countries. And I would like to broaden that for nonfiction. Read countries that I'm not familiar with. This year I read a nonfiction book that was set largely around Haiti, and I would like to do more of that. Just grab books that are set in countries I don't know very well or haven't read before. The other goal for nonfiction is to read 5 nonfiction books that are about topics prior to 1920. Most of the nonfiction I read, and honestly most of the fiction as well, is either contemporary or recent history. I don't read a lot that's set before World War II. That tends to be my cutoff, and I would like to branch out, and 5 books is not a big ask. One of my favorite books of 2019 was kind of about the 19-teens and 1920s. So I just figure, more than 100 years ago, I need to read 5 nonfiction books. And I think that's something I can do. And I think I'll learn more about interesting topics that I just don't normally gravitate toward. I would also like to read more classics in 2020 than I read in 2019. And this is one of the numbers that I don't know exactly yet, but I believe it will be 4. Maybe 5 if I really push myself, but probably 4. So I would just like to read more classics in 2020. Just like, obviously I can read like double if I feel like it, but just one more I would be okay with. I just want to push myself to read more classics because it's not that I don't enjoy classics, it's just that it is very hard for me to pick them up and just like start reading them. And then once I read them, I'm like, oh, like I like this. Sometimes I hate some classics, but like that's just what reading is. But I would like to push myself to read more and just not have a huge goal, but just work to improve it a little bit every year. I would also like to read 5 adult fantasy books. I did have a goal for just fantasy in general last year. Didn't hit it, but all of the fantasy I read was either middle grade or young adult. And I would like to push myself to read more adult fantasy, just because I haven't. There are very few adult fantasy books that I have read in my life. Like, genuinely very few. So it's something I would like to push myself to get into more, to try a little bit. And if I don't like it, that's fine. But I do tend to like fantasy when I read it. It's an intimidating genre for me. I would also like to read 2 anthologies off my shelf, and for the purpose of this, I'm defining an anthology as a collection of works from different authors instead of just like a collection of short stories from one author or a collection of articles or whatever. I have a number on my shelves. I have like a full shelf that's just like anthologies I've collected that sound interesting, that have authors I enjoy, and I just never pick them up because they're very hard for me to pick up. Last year I had a goal of reading 5, I read 0. So this year I'm hoping with a goal of 2, it will be easier to just force myself to pick them up because I know I'll enjoy them, some of them at least. I bought them because I thought I would enjoy them, but I never read them. And the last number goal is to read 6 authors who aren't cisgender. In 2019, I read 3, and I would like to double that because 6 is not a big ask. I'm definitely gonna have to like research this one and specifically seek out authors who are either trans or non-binary, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And it is something that like I should read more broadly. I shouldn't read just almost entirely cisgender authors. So again, doubling that for 2020 I think is going to be a good goal for me. And then my last goal is kind of the big one and the one that I would consider probably my most important for the year to actually hit it specifically. The rest, if I get close, I'm fine with that. If I read like 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5, that kind of shows me that I tried in that goal, and that's close enough for a success. But for this goal, I really want to hit the number specifically, and that is to read 50% or fewer authors who are white Americans. 2019 was the first year that I tracked my reading. I tracked my stats. I kind of tracked like who the authors were, what countries they were from, whether they were like white or people of color or what have you. I tracked a lot of different things. In terms of like genre and age group, it was very interesting to see. Like there wasn't a whole lot I wanted to change apart from like a few tweaks of trying some adult fantasy or like broadening my horizons on nonfiction, which I already read a fair amount of. But the vast majority of the authors I read were white Americans. Like, I would say 80% of the authors I read were white Americans, and that is very, very specific and very, very limited. I don't mind that that is a lot of what I read, considering that I am a white American. I'm not saying I want to stop reading white Americans, but there's no reason that stat should be more than 50%. Like, and I'm not even saying that I want 50% of either or. I'm saying both together. So, like, someone can be white and a British person, and that wouldn't count, or they can be black and American, and that wouldn't count. It's just, it's kind of ridiculous how much of what I read is written by people who are both white and American. So that's a really big one for me this year, and that is something that I want to heavily focus on. And I think of all of these goals, this is the one that really is most important to me. So those are all my specific reading focus goals, and then getting into more like the Booktube social reading habits type stuff. I am hosting the Booktube Rereadathon again for 2020. My goal for 2019 was for that to go well and me to stick with it throughout the year and read the 12 rereads. I kind of did that. I got all 12 of them reread. It just wasn't always on time. So for 2020, I would like to focus on getting through the year again and rereading all 12 books, but also reading them on time would be a good goal because I was very, very late with Middlesex this year. And just like, I would like to do it. I think just having it be successful again would be a win in and of itself. I also want to limit how much I use the library this year. I didn't set a specific library goal last year because I said instead of doing that, I was just going to focus on the number of books on my TBR and getting that down. And that went terribly. I actually went up 30 books. So I have about 30 more books this year than I had in 2019 on my unread shelves. So, since that clearly didn't work, I'm going the other way and I'm specifically limiting how many books I can check out from the library. And my limit is going to be one book per month with exceptions. The exceptions are anything that is part of a series doesn't count excepting the first book. So anything that's the later part of a series doesn't count towards this because I don't want to limit my series reading. Anything that is a buddy read or for a read-along doesn't count. Anything that's specifically for one of these other goals doesn't count. Pretty much anything I can justify reading and saying I specifically want to read this book now won't count towards that. What I want to limit is just going to the library and picking up random things just because I can. Because that's really where my problem is with not reading the books I own. It's because I go to the library and I just look at the shelves and I'm like, this sounds like it might be okay. And then I read it and it's like a 3-star read and it's like, that was fine. But I have 20 books on my shelf right in front of me right now that all look amazing that I'm not reading because I saw this book that might be okay from the library and it turned out to be okay. So I'm hoping this will help curb my habit of just going to the library every single week and reading only library books. Because it's not that the library is bad, it's just that I really do want to focus on reading my shelves. So that's also going to be a really big goal for me this year. Another goal that I just completely did not accomplish at all from 2019 was to reread all the books that I had received for free from either Goodreads or from publishers or wherever. A few years ago, I collected about 9 of these books that I just acquired from various places. I don't even remember where I got them now. I know that they fell into my possession somehow, and kind of under the implication that I would read them and review them. They weren't all given to me here, read this for a review. But that was why I got them all. It was literally my plan to just get these books and read them and review them. And I was in my mind getting them specifically to review them. But I didn't. I did read one book that I got for review this year in 2019, but it was a book that I also received in 2019, so I haven't touched the stack of old books that's 3 or 4 years old by this point. So, my goal is to read all of those books. It was my goal in 2019, and it is my goal in 2020, and I would actually really like to accomplish it this year, because I feel like it's just kind of rude that I haven't read any of those books. And, along the same lines, I would like to read all of the books, or at least most of the books, that I have received as gifts, because I have received a number of books from other booktubers, which is so lovely and so nice of them. And I feel bad when I just put those books on my shelves and don't read them for years and years. So reading all the books that I've received as gifts is also going to be a pretty big goal. That's just going to be the priority for the year when I don't know what to read. It's hey, I received these 25 books as a gift, so let's read one of those. So I would like to get through, maybe not all of those, I feel like that would be a pretty big ask, but I would like to get through a lot of them. And then my last goal for the year, these are pretty boring goals, but my last goal for the year is to start my book club. Back in August or something, I started talking about this book club I wanted to start, and I still want to do it. I'm just kind of waiting for my life to settle out and waiting to have a permanent job so that I kind of have an idea of what my schedule is going to be, and waiting to get into the habit of booktubing again and having enough time and knowing what the schedule is gonna be, and just I've been waiting for my my life to get regular again, and hopefully that should happen early this year. I should find out in late December whether or not I'm staying on my job or I have to get a new job, because it was a seasonal position that had the potential to become regular. So if the job I have now becomes a permanent thing, then I can start my book club hopefully in March or something. I would like to start reading the first book. I don't know who is actually interested in participating, if anyone, but it's something that I've wanted to do for a while. Depending on how my life goes, that might be a sooner versus later kind of thing, but it is my goal at some point next year to get my book club up and running. So these have been my goals. Hopefully I do a better job of hitting them than I did last year, because last year definitely had a few problems and a few goals I literally did not touch at all, but I'm hoping 2020 is going to be a really good year for my TBR spreadsheet and not reading quite so many white Americans.